Hi, my name is Nancy Carlson. I am the Disaster Behavioral Health Program Coordinator here at the Minnesota Department of Health in our Division of Emergency Preparedness and Response. I want to acknowledge that the presentation today was developed by Janet Yates. She was one of my contractors working with a lot of our trainings, and she is no longer with us at this point. She's taken another position, so it's good. It's all good, but she's not here to share these slides with you. Before we go any further, I just want to set a couple of things in place before we actually start talking about the presentation, is that I want us to kind of keep in mind that a lot of the political decisions and things that are going around now may have an impact on our mental well-being. Now, this is not a political statement in any way, shape, or form. It's just a recognition that decision makers will make some choices that some of us are going to disagree with and be uncomfortable with. And it may create some grief and loss issues for us. We just need to keep that in mind as we connect with friends, family, colleagues, and those that were in a position to help. Which leads me to also our trigger warning. I want to just remind you all that anytime we're discussing trauma, anyone can be triggered by a past traumatic event. Even if the particulars of the events that we're talking about today aren't really relevant to the trauma that's occurred to you in the past, it's possible to be triggered by a word, a smell, even only the thought of trauma or a traumatic situation. So it's really important to pay attention to your reactions to some of the material that we're going to be talking about today, and to realize that there's really no shame at all in having a trauma response. I hope that you won't minimize that response or ignore it, and that you'll do what you need to do in order to bring yourself back to a calm place. For some, that might be just attention to breath. It can help you manage what you're responding, what your response is. For others, you might need to talk to someone, a trusted friend, a colleague, or if you have a therapist. So we're going to start out by bringing us all into the same place together. We all have already been through a whole lot today. We've had meetings, we've had work we've been doing, and we have things that we may be going after today after we get finished with this presentation. Even if you're going home, if it's the end of your day, you've got your home life that you're dealing with. So before we begin talking today about our topic, I want us all to just take a moment to just relax and breathe and center ourselves into the present situation where we're at now. Just breathe. Our objectives for today are to understand the definition of defined and ambiguous losses, to really explore grief and loss challenges during difficult and traumatic situations, and to learn how to pay attention to and process grief for ourselves and others. A couple of sayings that I just want to quotes I want to just start off with because I think they set the stage for our discussion today. To get through grief, we must go through grief. There's no other way. Grief needs to be processed. It will wait for us, even for many years, but it will wait. And this one too. We're never finished with grief. It's part of the fabric of living. It's always waiting to happen. Love makes memories and life precious. The grief that comes to us is proportionate to that love and is inescapable. So grief is a part of life. As we consider grief, we need to really get clear about the two types of grief that we're talking about today, defined and ambiguous. And really, this whole presentation really centers around the work of Pauline Boss. She was a she's a marriage and family therapist from Minnesota here, that in the 1970s, she was treating spouses of missing in action military members, and she recognized some commonalities in their experiences. And she coined that term ambiguous loss. She defined it as occurring when there's a physical absence with a psychological presence. Like, a loved one's gone physically missing or bodily gone, but there's still that, or when there's a psychological absence and a physical presence, like Alzheimer's or dementia. Uh, Boss really felt that ambiguous loss differs from ordinary loss in that there's no verification of that death or certainty that that person or that lost item will come back or return in any way the way it used to be. We could also experience we also experienced a form of kind of ambiguous loss during COVID, right? When the grief became our daily experience. For most of us, it wasn't just the grieving of a loved one, because hopefully most of us here today did not have the death of a loved one during COVID, but more that pervasive sense of loss tied to that change in our daily routines, missing out on the planned celebrations of life, and being physically separated from friends and loved ones. So if you look at the slide, defined losses are those that have boundaries around them, such as when someone dies, we know they're not going to physically return to us, right? There may be questions around that defined loss. How did that loss occur? But there won't be questions as to the status of that loss. It's defined. We know what was lost from us. Ambiguous losses are those that have no clarity or definition. They're the losses that culture often doesn't recognize as losses, so the permission to grieve and process that loss isn't available. So, with ambiguous losses, there could be questions about the loss as well as the status of the loss. We'll spend really more time today talking about ambiguous loss because they're not as well understood or discussed by everyone. Thing to keep in mind as we move forward is just how often ambiguous and defined losses live together. Like when I talked about COVID, that was a time when we had a defined loss. There was a loss of job, there was a loss of living our life a certain way, but there was also ambiguous loss about what was going on with the situation and how long it was going to last. So we really want to be careful as we're looking at these two losses and defining them and paying attention to both types of loss. So, like I said, Dr. Pauline Boss created this term ambiguous loss to really refer to the situations where there's a lack of information. We can't, it's unclear. We don't know what that loss is. It can be physical or psychological, but there's no definition of it. There's no closure. There's no resolution. Ambiguous loss is really all about that lack of resolution or closure, and it creates a complicated form of grief. That complication is due to that lack of understanding, that lack of knowledge, that lack of closure, that ambiguity, and not a personal weakness is why that the grief is stronger in a way. It's really a relational component. It's caused by the lack of facts surrounding the loss of the loved one or the external forces that create that ambiguity that can impact those relationships. And really, Boss says that that's the stressor that lies within the social context that results in that confusions and feelings of helplessness. Excuse me. So, under this term that she defined of ambiguous loss, she also created two categories to differentiate between physical and psychological ambiguous loss. And she called them type 1 and type 2. So type 1 is that she called that leaving without saying goodbye. That's that physical absence that, it could be a kidnapping, a disappearance, a missing in action. It could be, any type of thing where the person is physically gone, but you don't know their status. You don't know if they're going to be able to be returned. So that's that leaving without saying goodbye. The second type of ambiguous loss is the psychological loss. It's when a loved one is physically present, but psychologically absent. I kind of experienced this one, and I'm going to continue to use this as how I relate to ambiguous loss throughout this training. It was just a little over a year ago, my mother passed, and she had Lewy body dementia. And she was physically there, but she was not psychologically there. That was a loss of goodbye without leaving. And many people are experiencing that when they're caring for elderly parents. But it could also be someone that has a chronic mental illness, could be someone addicted to drugs. It could be um, preoccupation at work or an obsession with the internet or the TV. They could be physically there, but they're not emotionally there with you anymore. So, how does this ambiguous loss impact us? Well, that's a loss that's seen often too. It People that are caretakers of people with dementia, there's been a lot of research on this. They experience some depression, anxiety, guilt, shame. Shame and feeling like this relationship, I wish I wasn't living with this relationship anymore. Um, a diminished sense of pleasure in their usual activities. Uh, you know, Ambivalence about the relationship, maybe trouble sleeping, abuse. The thing is, as Boss says, the brain doesn't really like ambiguity and continues to struggle to make some sense of it. She says, even when you're dreaming, when you are going to sleep and you're under a lot of stress, you try to work things out in your head. And even those situations, that ambiguity, you're trying to figure it out and make some sense of it, and there's no way to do it. That's why it's ambiguous loss. The thing is, like with any disaster or crisis, those of you that work in this field like I do, when we have a loss, when we have a trauma, life goes on anyway. It doesn't stop. It doesn't wait for that uncertainty to end. And I think we all saw that during COVID, years of it going on and living in uncertainty. And while we're living in those uncertainty, other losses can happen to us too. And those losses themselves can also be defined or ambiguous. So we have layers of stress and layers of grief and loss that we're trying to deal with at the same time. And that really puts a strain on our ability to cope. So ambiguous loss also impacts our across many things. And it's not a sign of weakness, the stress from it. Like we said, it's not a sign of a problem with things. The ambiguity is the issue. It's not it's not the relationship. It's the ambiguity that's occurring within that relationship. So it's relational. It creates problems that make the relationships kind of immobilized, unable to go forward. Decision making is difficult to do because you don't know what's going to happen next. If you have a family member that's been missing in action, we'll go back to, Pauline Boss's, Dr. Boss's, her situation. It's hard to make plans of what to do next with your family when you don't know if your loved one's going to be coming back or when they're going to be coming back. It's hard to make decisions when you're dealing with somebody with, say, dementia who's there, but not there when you don't know what's going to happen next with their illness or how long they're going to stay inside this state. So it's hard to make decisions about what to do next with your life. Coping is difficult. Your grief, you start to grieve, but you can't really completely finish your grieving process because the situation just is not moving forward. It's kind of staying there. That ambiguity stays and covers everything. Another aspect of it is that there's some disenfranchised grief. So that's that complicated type of grief that when a loved one disappear physically or psychologically, and that loss is not or cannot be openly acknowledged. Maybe they can't publicly mourn, or it's not socially supported to mourn because they don't have a defined loss that they can say has occurred for them. Or society itself doesn't feel like it's okay to mourn dealing with the situation that they're dealing with. You know, we've seen after large scale disasters, and there's a lot of research done on 9/11 after this, of family members who had missing people, um, that they didn't know how they could move forward or how they could even mourn the loss when they were still hoping that that person would be discovered, or at least their remains would be discovered so that they could process it. We saw this during the 35W bridge collapse, those of you that are here from Minnesota. That was a whole part of the family assistance center. A key part of it was to help people, as they were stuck in this ambiguity phase of their grief and loss, to support them and then, help them as they were able to move forward when they finally got some type of closure. It can also create conflict in family members because some people may want to move forward, have a more of an ability within themselves to go, okay, this situation, I've already decided what it is. I've already made a closure for myself. And other people are not able to do that or disagree with how that family member is seeing the situation. There may be issues of safety and security because of the whole ambiguity component of the situation. So people are going to remain, for the most part, immobilized until they can find some measure of meaning and hope, even if the uncertainty and loss remain. So, how can you live with ambiguity? How can you continue to function within this state of unknowingness? Well, we know that ambiguous loss is a relational condition. The goal of it is to really encourage and support resilience. We know that living well despite ambiguous loss really requires flexibility and a loose holding on to the familiar routines and way of relating to the situation and to others. Sometimes paradoxical thinking can be used to really increase coping, that both and thinking, that harmony with, rather than the either or mastery over. We can't master a situation when we don't know what that situation is or how it's going to be. But we can learn to kind of go that and both and thinking to deal with it. You know, this example of my mother again. I was both her daughter, I was her daughter, and both I was her mother. I was her caretaker. So it was that situation was both. You had to come to kind of an understanding of this was happening, but also this was happening. And it's not easy. And it's not easy to stay within that, but to be flexible within it rather than hoping for some clarity and waiting for something to happen that you can have some closure, that's just too stressful to live within that. Um, One of the things we need to know too is that closure is really a myth. So we need to stop really waiting for some resolution to the ambiguity and the idea that we can stop the situation from being, you know, that ambiguity that comes with the situation. We could clear it all up because there's so many things in life that really just are, we just don't have the answers for, and we never will. Because we can't just wait to live and function within it until we get those answers. And we also need to recognize that it's the person is normal, no matter if they're struggling with the ambiguity of the situation. That's not an issue to a judgment upon how their well-being is doing with it. It's the situation itself that's abnormal, not the reactions that the individual is having. So Boss really talks about how we can live and flexibly live and function within ambiguity. And she points out that it's resilience. It's building resilience. Now, I know this is also a trigger word for many people. We use the word, stress management and self-care and resilience a lot over the last few years, but they're really, it it doesn't mean that it's saying that there's nothing going on. I mean, like I said, it's the situation. We've already clarified. It's the situation that's the problem, not the individual. But the individual has to find the strength within themselves to be flexible and move forward and not, we're not worried about bouncing back. We're moving forward even within the ambiguity. So there's some ways that she recommends that we can do this. And I think this is for many situations. We could talk about it being a major loss of a person. We could talk it, whether it's an individual that is physically gone or psychologically gone. It could be about any situation that falls under that. And as we go through some of these, I'd like you to kind of think about some situations in your life that you were dealing with this type of ambiguous loss. Maybe you're dealing with something like this now. And how maybe some of these tips that she says help you be able to move forward even in the situation of ambiguity, how they could help you. And the first one really is finding meaning. So, what does the situation mean to you? And we talk about this a lot in psychological first aid too. The way to deal with any type of stress is to really be able to name their experience and its impact upon them. Once you have a name for your experience and you're really looking at what this experience is, what you're going through, what it's doing to you, that's the first step in being able to reduce and master some of that stress that you're dealing with. So, how can you tempering mastery? How can you master the situation? How do you let go of something you can't control? Well, part of that, like I said, is recognizing and accepting, and this is a tough one, okay? This sounds kind of like me just being really general, going, oh, recognizing and accepting that the world is not always fair. But there's truth in this. There's the older you get, the more you realize that this isn't just somebody saying something to make you feel better about a situation or to let you to move past it. There's truth in recognizing that the world isn't fair and it's okay to let go sometimes of a situation. It's okay to be in that but and that paradoxical thinking. It's okay to not wait for something to resolve itself that may never resolve itself. And while you're doing that, how can you reconstruct your identity? Because if your identity, let's say, is a wife of a soldier or a husband of a soldier um, that is deployed and missing in action, how do you identify yourself? How can you move forward with this? How are you going to, who are you now? For me, like who was I had to stop and think about who was I now when I felt like I was in the mother role with my mother. Am I still a daughter if my mother doesn't recognize who I am? You have to redefine those relationships and be able to really develop some resilience after ambiguous loss. Once again, it's that ability to be flexible in relationships, to use that both. Yes, I still am a daughter and I'm a mother in this role. It's reshaping our identity and recognizing that you can do that paradoxical thinking for your identity. And then it's really normalizing the ambivalence. What do I do with those conflicted feelings that I have about this situation? Am I happy? For me, it's like, was I happy that my mother was still there, even when she didn't know who she was? And frankly, my mother had a form of Lewy body dementia that she most of the time knew who you were. It wasn't, it was more of a psychosis. So she was not at all herself a lot of the time. So she would sometimes recognize who you were, but even when she recognized who you were, she didn't, it was like she had weird scenarios of things that were going on. So I had to really kind of think about my ambivalence. Am I happy that she was still alive going through this? But I was angry that I was trapped inside this situation with her. And I was angry for her that she was living through something like this. And I wished it was over. And then I felt guilty for thinking that. With ambiguous loss, we need to be able to normalize these conflicting feelings, of being happy that you're still spending time with the loved one, but for my case, loved one, but also wishing that you weren't at this because this situation was not one that she or you were really enjoying. So how can we normalize that? How can we accept those conflicting emotions and know that that's what occurs? Those are common reactions, and not to make ourselves feel guilty for having those reactions inside that type of situation. So then how do we revise that attachment? How can I let go and still remember? How can I successfully practice the both and thinking and hold on to my memories of the good things that happened before that? Boss says that we can do this by grieving what was lost, but celebrating what remains. It's okay to grieve the loss of for me, in my case, grieve the loss of the mother that was there before this, but then be happy too and celebrate those memories that we had and the fact that I still had some more time with her, even in this bizarre situation. And then she recommends that the final thing is that we have to discover some hope. How do we find hope in an ongoing loss that has really no closure? Once people become comfortable with ambiguity and uncertainty, they're freer to really imagine and discover new sources of hope, new sources of hope in the situation, of their future, of their relationships, of how just inside learning about the resilience that they've built up within themselves through this experience. So those are her recommendations for this. But I want us to kind of think about too how we can all, and I want us to spend a few moments with this and even maybe hopefully put some things in the chat. When we're dealing with grief and loss, we don't want advice, right? We definitely don't want to be told how we feel or how we should feel. What we want is just somebody to sit in that mud and gunk with us, right? We talk about this again in PFA. What we want is just that comforting presence, somebody to be with us so that we're not stuck in the mud all alone. So, what keeps you stuck in the mud? And how can you sit in the mud with somebody else? I know that one of the things that helped me was I had to stop and think. And my best friend actually reminded me of this that I had been with her when she had gone through this with her mother. And I didn't really think about that during my own experience. And she just reminded me of just the importance of not being alone. Yes, overthinking everything. And that's what I was just pointing out. It's easier to sit in the mud with someone else if you've had the experience. And that's basically what she was telling me. That's the exact same thing. It is. You feel more comfortable doing it and you know the benefits of it. You know the benefits of just being with somebody. And I know it seems simplistic, but one of the things that we know and that research has shown us time and time again is that social connection, that ability to hold the space. Yes, as Darcy said, for grief, it's okay to sit in that silence. In fact, that can be so helpful. That's also true. The danger, if you're sitting with someone who's had the experience, is not making it about your experience, but just validating what they're feeling and where they are. Absolutely true. Because it's sitting in the mud with them. You can keep putting things in the chat if you want. I'm going to move forward. We may get done early, and I don't think anybody has a problem with that. So, what gets in the way of us grieving our losses? And a few things can complicate this process. Layers of loss, as we talked about earlier, make it more difficult to grieve because it all feels like too much. And many times we all have that components of layers of loss because regardless of what is going on with inside our relationships, we also have experiences that we've been through. And how we've dealt with those experiences, the marks they've left on us, can be both positive and negative. We all have cultural beliefs about grief and loss. Yes. Others' expectations, those attitudes, beliefs, practices regarding death, mourning, and grief, they vary very widely between individuals and across different cultural groups. We all have, many of us might have religious or spiritual beliefs about grief and loss. And those beliefs can provide comfort and guidance and support and a sense of connection. They can help enhance our resilience. They can also create feelings of guilt, conflict, and with differing beliefs. And our personal beliefs about grief and loss, even within a shared culture or religion, really had create our expectations and our how we relate to the loss of a loved one, individual, or a situation. These things are things that occur to us are highly personal and unique. And all of our personal variables, such as the family, our family rituals, our family beliefs, our individual personality, how do we react to stress? Are we more positive and trying to look at things on the positive, or are we dealing with some PTSD in our past and some trauma or some depression? You know, what are we dealing with? What supports do we have to help us through this economically, socially, financially, all of these things? How can they all can be supportive of us or really get in the way of making our grieving successful and less painful. There isn't really any one way to grieve. Everyone grieves in their own way and in their own time. There's no length that's a normal time or an abnormal time. Some griefs can last a lifetime and be normal. Not all losses are the same in each person, and not all losses will be grieved the same. And one thing I want to really point out here, and because it kind of becomes a bit of a trigger sometimes for anyone that's talked about grief and loss, is Kubler-Ross did not write about stages of grief. She wrote about the stages of death and dying and the grief related to death and dying. So next time you see that, and you can look it up. She has some great articles out there, and to her original one, I forget what year it was, but you can look it up and really kind of clarify that. It's just kind of over the years, like many information that gets out there, one person says it and another repeats it, and now she's got the stages of grief, but they're not. And even if they were, that doesn't mean everybody goes through it the same way. We hold our grief differently. This is a great visual of this because some people believe that grief shrinks over time, as we see inside these jars on the top. You get the big ball within it, then a smaller ball, then a teenier ball. But that's not really how we manage grief as human beings. What we do is our reservoir of how we deal with things, whether it's grief, whether it's loss, gets bigger. It's not that pain gets smaller. It's just that our ability to deal with it gets larger. You can see how, what happens when we grow around our grief. I love this picture because it's so true. And sometimes that process of growing larger around it takes long time. And it doesn't always happen for everyone. It really depends on all the stuff that we talked about earlier, too, what all they're dealing with, the supports that they might have socially and just in life to function. So what also makes those losses more challenging? And this is just a beginning list of it. Yes, absolutely. Based on that. Oh, I love this. Somebody put a picture inside the chat on shock, initial shock at hearing the bad news, denial, trying to avoid the inevitable, anger, outpouring the bottled up emotion, bargaining, looking for a way out, depression, final realization of the inevitable, testing, seeking realistic solutions, and acceptance, finding a way to keep going. And this, she said, was an expansion of the Kubler-Ross stages. And I read them aloud because I don't think, like I said, we're recording this and I wanted people to see this. Yes, and some people may go through these. And even when you're talking about Kubler-Ross's stages, nobody goes from necessarily one step to the next step to the next step to the next step. You're hopping all over the place. You might be in shock, and then you go to bargaining, then you go back to denial, or you're hopping around all over the place. It's not a steady linear path forward on any of these type of things when you're dealing with grief from death or you're dealing with ambiguous loss. It's a complicated process. It depends too on the type of loss. Defined loss, not that defined loss isn't difficult to get over. It's a little bit easier because you can say and be able to say what you've lost and look at your life and make those steps of moving forward easier because you are able to know and clearly know how you can move to the next stage. Unexpected losses are hard, and unfortunately, most of the losses that we deal with in our life are unexpected. Even if we have a heads up that something could happen, we're not really expecting it to because we're hoping it won't. Any untimely loss, when we have a lack of clarity in the relationship, did we really lose something or did we not lose something? And what did we lose? Like I mentioned earlier, that complicated or disenfranchised grief, meaning that when it's not recognized by society and that unrecognized bereavement is really makes it difficult to move forward and to build your resilience. And like I said, loss of social support. Social support is critical in everything we do for our well-being. I just have to throw that out there in every single thing we do. So move this. All right, let's slide. There we go. So knowing all this, what do we do? How do we grieve? I've got a few things on here. What kind of recommendations would you give people to help them to move forward? Obviously, be kind to yourself, right? Someone mentioned earlier making space. And I think that's critical. We need to have the space physically and emotionally to be able to get that time to think about and make that clarity and to, define what's going on with us and make meaning of it. We need to pay attention to it. Sometimes it is too big for us to handle on our own. Yeah, new grief triggers old grief. Absolutely. If you experience multiple losses, you may need to assess where your feelings are coming from. Absolutely. And you will, as we talked before, there'll be layers of grief. You could be moving forward and dealing with the situation, and something can trigger it quite easily. My daughter is deaf. She when she was, and she's adult now, she's in her 40s, but when she was 9 months old, she was very, very sick. We were in the military. She was medevac to a military hospital, almost died. She was in the hospital for months. And she ended up losing her hearing from this and having some other health difficulties. And I'm, for the most part, I spent a long time dealing with guilt and with ambiguity with this situation on what all the things were going to occur with her from this illness. And for the most part, I'm healed from that. But when I hear parents talking about an ill infant, sometimes I find myself crying. It's still there. So it can be triggered by many things can come out. And you have to kind of deal with those things too and try to figure out, okay, that's just a trigger. I know that that's already gone, but you have to pay attention to it. Just like I mentioned earlier about you need to acknowledge the trauma that you're experiencing, your trauma reactions, because we need to go through our grief. We can't ignore it. And talking to someone, if it's a friend, family member, somebody you trust. Yes, have them time to feel, to talk about the person they're grieving with without making them feel as if they should be moving on because of your discomfort. Absolutely. Memories are powerful. Like we talked about, you need to be able to see the good. Those memories are part of what you hang on to, especially when things are ambiguous. That's the that's the positive in the situation. and they need to talk about it. We can't find meaning inside a situation without re going over it and over it inside our heads. And as we're doing that, we need to also be saying that aloud and talking to someone and being there, holding that space, being there, sitting in the mud with somebody and letting them talk without making it about you and without saying, it's time to get past this or you're going to be great in the future. None of those things that we want to say to make ourselves actually feel good. We don't need to do that, but to be there with them. And then to do things too, aside even just from talking, to find ways that we can express ourselves. Maybe we can't talk it out. Maybe we're not ready to talk it out. And some people just can't find the words to express what they're feeling, but they still need to get it out. They need to express themselves in some way. Draw and paint doesn't have to be something worthy of hanging in a gallery. Create something. Maybe it's read something. Maybe it's going reading about other people's experience to normalize your own. Whatever you need to do to helps you engage yourself in your grief. Because too often we're told in society to get over it as quick as we can and just ignore it then. And then it'll just go away. When we know that's not true. That's not what's going to happen. We need to find the time to just acknowledge it and move through it. As people have been saying, we want to surround ourselves with safe people who will accept and encourage our grief and won't try to cut it short. I want to read this again. This is a saying that I think is wonderful. No rule book, no time frame, no judgment. Grief is as individual as a fingerprint. Do what's right for your soul. And I love how Courtney, we were talking earlier, she has some things going on now, says that in my grief, it has helped so much to connect with other people who know the person I lost. We're grieving together, which for me is helpful. I don't want to grieve in isolation. And nobody should, Courtney. Nobody should. You know, that's the strength of that social connection. And to give yourself time. And as you're giving yourself time, to also care for yourself. Love yourself, especially hard if you've lost someone who has provided that love and self-worth that we shouldn't be getting from someone else, but many of us do, to kind of find a way to give that to ourselves. All those things that we as public health people talk about that we need to do every day and we may not practice. Yes, the self-care part is the hardest, Courtney, because we're all really good at saying what we should do. It's harder to do it, but you really need to do that. You need to recognize yourself. And how can we be a giver? People, you've all been saying it. You have a wonderful group here. You've all recognized this already. The best way to help a griever is to listen, listen, listen. And you don't have to say a thing, as someone said earlier. You can just be there with them and silent, just so they know they're not alone. We're too tempted, especially those of us that come from the mental health area, or are caregivers in any way. We want to say something that we think is helpful. Sometimes we're uncomfortable with the silence. So we need to get used to being in the silence. Yes, learn to be with them in the silence, in the tears, and the laughter. We don't want to we say things sometimes like you'll be fine, or I know how you feel, you're doing great, you're so strong. But we say these not really for the griever. We say it because it makes us feel better. We feel like we've done something now to we said something positive to them when we really don't have to do that. It's just being present, but also taking the initiative. Sometimes we feel like, okay, I've asked them if they want anything or they need any help, and they've said they can't. No, they don't. That's because they can't. Either it's hard to ask for help. For many, many of us, it's hard to say what we need. We haven't really been taught to be acceptable in this society to say what I need. Yeah. Or that's like Courtney was saying, one thing I've struggled with is people asking me to call them or how to ask for help. Just do it for them. That's what we're saying. Just take the initiative. Just say something like we have on here in the slide. I'm making lasagna. I'll make you want to drop it off tomorrow, or I'll call you Thursday after. I'll call you, tomorrow and check in on you. Don't ask them to tell you what they need. For one thing, they may still not know. They're in the midst of this grief. And it's putting another stressor upon them, and they don't want to do that. They don't want to put you out. And especially Minnesota here, we have this thing where, oh, no, no, we're fine. Let me help you. But we need to be able to just do it, just say we're going to do it. I want to support you is meaningless. Like, yeah, like Courtney says, it's meaningless without actions behind it. Anybody can say, I want to support you. Show it. Show it with an action. Even if that action is just being there with them, calling them. Don't just send a text, how are you doing? Make it a phone call. You might text and go, can we talk now? Are you free? That's fine. But you need to be, the best thing is really to be in person if they're comfortable with that. And get comfortable with being uncomfortable. It's not comfortable to listen to somebody else's grief. It's not comfortable to be in a situation, especially for those of us that are caregivers, to not be able to resolve their problem that they've got going on, their pain, not being able to fix it. A lot of us are fix it people. We want to fix it. Be comfortable to be inside that uncomfortable position and sit in the mud with them. Oh, this is a good one that Courtney said. I'd like to see how you're doing. Is now a good time to call? That is one of the best messages she said she'd received. And that's a perfect way to do it. You're taking the initiative, but you're also making sure that this person is open to it. But don't feel like you have to do something to fix it for them because you can't. What you can do for them is be a safe person, be a comforting person. It's not your issue to solve, and you can't solve it anyway. What I love, and this is moving closer toward the end of this, but I wanted to tell you, I don't know if you're a little Piglet story person or not, but I love this story between Piglet and Pooh. So I'm going to read the slide totally to you. Today was a difficult day, said Pooh. There was a pause. Do you want to talk about it? Said Piglet. No, said Pooh after a bit. No, I don't think I do. That's okay, said Piglet. And he came and he sat beside his friend. What are you doing? Asked Pooh. Nothing really, said Piglet. Only I know what difficult days are like. I quite often don't feel like talking about it on my difficult days either. But goodness, continued Piglet, difficult days are so much easier when you know you've got someone there for you, and I'll always be there for you, Pooh. Just knowing that being there for someone is the best thing that we can do when we're helping people that grieve. Like I said, we're going to finish earlier today because these were Janet's slides, and she probably had some other stories with them, and I took this over for her at the last minute, but I hope you got what you needed from this. I want to share some resources. I really, really encourage you to check out all of the work by Pauline Boss. She has some great books that she's written on loss and ambiguous loss. Um, and I would really encourage you she wrote one during the pandemic of loss during the time of the pandemic that I think these are wonderful, and I would encourage you to follow up on those. And then are there any questions from anyone? Otherwise, I'm going to ask that you send me an email, and I'm going to give you my email. If you want a certificate that you can use for CEUs with your board, I want you to send me an email and say that you want a certificate, and I will send you one. Otherwise, we're going to end almost in half an hour, well, a little over half an hour early today, and you'll get some time to take care of yourself.